All right, welcome to another episode of the Launch Notes podcast. I'm Blake from Launch Notes. Really excited to be joined by our guest today. This is Seif Salama. Seif's at Carta, where he's the head of product marketing, also held PMM roles at a ton of really iconic Silicon Valley companies, AngelList, Zynga, Affirm, Google. Really exciting stuff to dive into. Can't wait to just sort of figure out some of what Seif's learned along the way. Welcome to the podcast, Seif. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Dude, we were just talking before the recording that you kind of fell into this career with product marketing. Maybe give us a little overview of how you got started on this.
Chance. So I was born and raised in Egypt, and I think my sophomore year, maybe my junior year in college, there's some career fair. Google had a booth in there. I just put my resume. I was like, whatever. Like, I guess that doesn't happen because everyone does it.
You didn't think you just get plucked into Google right away?
It's just like,
yeah,
you're like, whatever. Everyone's resume is there. And like, I get the call and I take the interview, and it's like kind of a vague role that I don't fully understand. I studied like English and comparative literature and then marketing. So like a double major, being like, oh, I'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Because like you're 18 and what do you know? So yeah. And then I interviewed and I got my first job, and I remember we couldn't even, oh God, hopefully that's not going to cause anyone any trouble at some point. But like we figured out in order for them to keep me for the full year, I had to stay a student because technically the head count wasn't like a full-time head count. So I stayed an extra half year in college just to work at Google. But like I didn't really have a class to go to. So
you just like held on to the ID and just, yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So like and then kind of, because it wasn't really a full-time job, I had to find a job after it at Google, and I interviewed in all these different places, and they'd be like, we have our own interns, or like, I didn't do well in the interview, so I don't get the job. And then like one last shot was I had this interview in Singapore, and I took the call, and then I was like, okay, sure. Like, why not? And I thought I did terribly in the interview. And then they called me a couple of weeks later when I was in Amsterdam because I was no job and out of college. So like, where do you go? And they were like, oh, we need you in Singapore in like 15 days.
Nice.
I got the job. I was like, cool. And that was it. And then kind of the career took care of itself over time.
Very cool. So you were doing product marketing by that point once you landed in Singapore?
Oh, I was doing product marketing when I was in Cairo and Dubai.
Yeah.
Like,
okay, yeah, very cool.
The role wasn't called product marketing on paper, but I was on the product marketing team.
Okay, got it. On paper, like, was it like a business kind of associate. Like an ad sales sort of situation?
Business associate was the official title.
Yeah. But you start developing the muscle memory of a product marketer. It sounds like.
Well, okay. Now we're taking a complete different path, but like week 1 or 2 on the job, my boss, shout out Doha, now leads marketing for Huawei in the Middle East. They were shooting Google Street View at the pyramids because the problem when decision making happens in Mountain View, but the local teams have to deal with the decision making, is they've approved everything and everything happened in August, and you don't send people to shoot stuff around the pyramid in August because that is not great.
Yeah, because it's
on my second week on the job, they're like, okay, cool. The person who was supposed to shoot this has a heat stroke. So like, Seif, we need your help. So I put on the Google Street View Trek and just like did the thing because like, I guess that's product market is like, make sure it gets done.
Amazing. Yeah.
And then worked on the campaign, releasing it, etc. But I ended up with some like badass pictures with me in like the desert with a backpack, with the Google backpack.
That's awesome. I've crossed paths a handful of times, including with guests on this show about, folks who started their product marketing career at Google, and like, seems like a really awesome program and a great place, especially for starting your career. Like, it's always struck me as one of the maybe few big companies that like really invests in like growing product marketing talent, especially from, the kind of entry level and from like the kind of college and associate career track. And like, there's a lot of, really outstanding product marketers who have started at Google. Something in the water there. Like, are they just like working hard to make sure that role like has the resources and support it needs? Like, what is it about getting started there?
I mean, I think I lucked out. I was not as talented as almost anyone in that program. And I struggled with that early on because I was like, oh, these people went to all these schools like Harvard and Penn and Yale. And like, you show up and you're like, you just went to some school in Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. But like, you know, like you go through that. Oh my God, I don't have the name. And someone told me like, and I shared that with someone when I was there, and they're like, you got to the same place as these people, like who probably had it a bit easier, but it was like an incredibly talented group of people. And the program itself made a lot, like it was great. You go in for 2 years, you kind of fall into a job, and then you rotate into a second role. And between the first and second rotation as an APMM, you get to travel like to a local market and work on a couple of problems, which is like pretty cool. You get 20 to 30 people all straight from college trying to become PMMs. You're doing a lot of grunt work, but you learn a ton about like how it is a pretty cool job for someone to come right out of college and learn it. It gives you my understanding of the world.
How so?
Because when you take someone out of college and you give them Google and Google resources, you think the world works like
that. 100%. That totally makes sense.
Like, you really walk in, because that's your first idea of the world. Like, yes, you had internships and blah, 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 but like, you're like, that's how the world works.
Yeah.
So
it's so interesting in tech. Like you see that a lot, and it's kind of this like, you know, you could be working in tech, and it's either kind of like feast and or famine. Like it's like, especially in like marketing or product marketing, where it's like, man, maybe I'm at Google and I have resources for everything. And it's like, if I need to send an email campaign, there's a whole team of people who can specialize that and like help me, you know, figure out the mechanics of that and set me up for best practices. Or same for if you're doing an event or a, you know, social media campaign or whatever it is. Like we had a similar experience at Atlassian where it was like, cool, you're doing product marketing. There's all these like expert support functions to support you in different things. And then as I did, it's like, you go back to a startup and it's like, you want to send an email? Like, I think the MailChimp password's around here somewhere, right? Like, you want to stand up a landing page? Like, go for it. Like, here's the login. Like, let's go and do it. So yeah, and that's always my sort of expectation setting when people ask about jumping between like big company and startup. It's like, you'll be able to like move fast and be hands-on in a way that you never would have there, but like, you're going to have to learn a lot of stuff yourself and not get the hand holding for it.
And trust me, like a couple of my mentors were like, hey, there's a huge change. I was like, yeah, sure. And I did not, definitely. I was like, there was a learning curve.
Same way. But because I went from Atlassian to, you know, with maybe 100 plus product marketers to first and only product marketer at a startup. Right. And it's like, cool, like figure it out. And it's like, as intellectually prepared for that as you might be, like there's nothing like doing it.
Yeah, it's definitely different. I was saying that like being at Google makes you, in the grand scheme of like product marketing toolkit, if there's anything that Google has made me great at, it's like writing briefs and writing like documentation. Like, I think it's an invaluable skill.
Yeah. Can you talk a little more about that, or like what did you learn about that, or like what kind of made that click for you, or any moment or takeaway on that? Because I totally agree with you.
Your point, like what I mean by like it skewed my understanding of the world is after I left, I would go to different companies that you mentioned earlier, and I'd be like, "Where is the brief for this thing?" And people would look at me like the idea of a brief wasn't very common.
Yeah.
At least like,
it's like, we just talked about it. What do you mean?
Right. And they go like, or they have like a PRD or like something like that, but you'll talk to teams and there won't be like initiative briefs or these ways of making sure we're all aligned on the same thing.
Yeah.
And the flip side of that is I've worked with product marketers who write high level briefs and like long briefs. And Google was really good at like what they called the napkin brief, which is like, it needs to fit on a page. And if you can't fit it on a page, like you really don't understand what you're trying to do, because if you did, then you could very concisely tell us what it is.
I love that. Yeah.
And that's one of the things like that has always pushed us to become more targeted and more focused and like very aware of what we're trying to do versus like larger briefs that can have like a bunch of scope creep because you just you're not as detailed as you should be.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that's one of like, that's like the hardest and like most important part of writing, in my opinion, is just like, how do I boil this down? You like, basically like, how do I do the work of figuring this out so the reader doesn't have to? So the reader can just get it right away. Like, but a lot of it's like, for me, like lazy writing, number one, is like, this is just every thought I have on this, and this is just total scope creep. There's a bigger conversation I could do about how we teach writing in this country that encourages a lot of this and creates a lot of bad habits that we then have to unlearn. But yeah, like the ability to do that in a concise way is super important. Let me ask you this then, because this is something I struggled with as well, like kind of being in a similar situation. So if you do that, like kind of go from Google to a startup, when you encounter things like that, where it's like, oh, it's like, that's not done here. There's the urge. I've kind of had this where it's like, you have this conflict around like, well, should it be done here? Like basically like who's doing it wrong? Or like, should I be the one who's open-minded and changes my way? Or should I be the one who introduces this thing that I, always thought was helpful and brings it to here? Or am I being too big company guy and need to change my ways? How do you kind of like wrestle with that and figure that out?
I could tell you how I would do it today versus how I did it.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds familiar too.
Like I could tell you, here's how you do it, or I could tell you, here's what actually happened, and like what I learned from it is like what actually happened is I shut down. I panicked because I was like, whoa, this is not what I'm used to. So I didn't know how to operate in that world. And I was very, 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 very lucky to have a great manager, Michael Nurek, who's now at a firm, who really like sat with me and was like, what's going on? Like, let's actually, like, this is not the same person we interviewed. Like, we think we need to work on these things. And I think that also changed my perception of managers as well. Over time, when you see someone do that with you, it stays. And he pushed me, and like I found my groove at Zynga, and I was like, okay, I get how, okay, the world doesn't operate that way. And Zynga wasn't like a very scrappy startup, but it was still big. The scrappy startup-y stuff was at Affirm, but I think I would have failed miserably at Affirm if I went from Google to Affirm right away. I think I would have failed miserably. And then Michael really helped me see like how to operate in that world. And once I got comfortable with the lack of resources, I got uncomfortable with the pace of operation. So I was like, okay, I get that we have to do some stuff in a little bit of a scrappy way, but mobile gaming moves a bit slower than I would like to like move.
Got it.
And that's
got it.
where I was like, I need to find something a bit more fast paced.
Got it. And then so you Zynga to Carta then was the journey?
Zynga to Affirm.
Oh, Zynga to Affirm and then Affirm to
AngelList to Carta. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I wanna be sure I wanna get to Carta because I'm sure there's plenty to talk about there. And yeah, first off, what a company. I mean, we're customers. I think probably every startup I've been at has been a customer. But you mind maybe setting the scene a little bit just around like product marketing and marketing, especially like kind of what was going on when you came in and then kind of where are we at now and kind of how's that timeline played out?
Yeah. So I joined Carta almost a year and a half ago in August of 21. When I joined, we're a very early marketing team. So we were about maybe 25, 30 or so. I remember my recruiting call very vividly. Jane, who's our CMO and my boss, like called me and I was like, no chance. There's no chance I'm going there. Like, no way. And we had
they wouldn't take you or you didn't want it?
That I didn't want it. I was like, no chance. I was like, no, come on. Because they were like a direct competitor with AngelList in certain places. So I was it was an interesting relationship. So I was like, okay. And then we kept talking for a little bit. And in most of my career, I've optimized for something or the other. And in this case, I was really optimizing for my own growth because when Jane and I chatted, she was like, product marketing is very important for us as an area of investment and growth. And like, you hear all the hiring manager stuff. It's like, oh, your profile is great, blah, blah, blah. And you go like, sure, but like, let's actually talk and see if this makes sense. Mm-hmm. And we talked and it made sense, and kind of things that AngelList were starting to feel like, okay, the investment in marketing is not going to be the same in terms of like what I want to do. So by the time I joined, there was Carly, who was actually the reason I got introduced to you guys. Carly, her background, she had extensive background at Carta and then moved into PMM. And I was like kind of the first person from outside of Carta coming to do PMM. And we built the initial team together for the first year or so. Yeah, about that. And then kind of my focus area slowly increased from one business line to three. And then over time, I've taken over the team. So I think between me joining, we went from 2-ish PMMs. Yeah, when I joined, there was 2 of us. And then now I think we're going to be 12 or 13 before the end of the year. And the marketing team also went from, anywhere from 30 to 40 when I first joined. And we're about 120 today.
That's pretty incredible growth, especially 1 or 2 on the PMM team to 11 or 12 in a year and a half. Like, I can't imagine how many interviews that was. Just to hire that many people, I'm sure you're talking to 100 plus candidates. Like, were you just interviewing people? Have you just been interviewing people for a year straight, or what?
I've asked Sophie Lee's our recruiting, like, how many people I've interviewed, and I think she mentioned something along the lines of like 100 or 107 or something like that.
All right, I don't care if you're setting out to be better at interviewing or learn great insights at interviewing or anything, but you just do anything like that many repetitions, like you're going to learn a lot and you're going to grow a lot. So what like interview realizations have you had having done, having been on this much of a run of, interviews and hiring?
Something and I'm sure everyone does that. You pick up different habits from different companies you've worked at because you're like, ooh, that's a very cool way they look at stuff.
Yep.
Or like, that framework makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first things I did when I joined Carta is like, we did what is called competency-based hiring, which is, I took that framework I learned at AngelList, and really, it takes out all biases, because then you're just asking people specifically about like, each person goes in with a area of expertise that they test against versus saying like, oh, see if you vibe with this person, or like ask them how you would work together. It's all based off of like specific competencies that are important for a PMM. So for example, like some of the stuff we ask about is like centricity. Is that something that this candidate exhibits or not? And it's like, kind of, here's what a good answer sounds like. Here's what they might overuse. Here's what they might underuse. And it's kind of more of a framework that focuses on that. So that helped a lot in terms of like, how do we interview in general? So you're not, so when a panel is interviewing one person, we're really talking about the area of expertise and the competency versus like this answer didn't really sit well with me. I was like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And then the thing I learned scaling is like the skill sets that I was looking for early on changed dramatically. So like PMM hire number 1 looks very, very different than PMM hire number like 10.
Okay, sure.
And I would say like PMM number 1 probably wouldn't be on the team today. Like if we're hiring for the same.
Yeah, I get that. And I think it's a good call out. Like people hear that kind of thing, and the sort of visceral reaction can be like, oh, like one of those people is like, they're not good enough to be number 10, or they're like, they wish they, would have hired someone else, or blah, blah, blah. Some of the most like, I don't know, self-aware, intelligent people that I've worked with are very good at knowing like when they themselves are right and wrong for a role. And like some of the best people I've worked with have like intentionally left companies or joined companies knowing like, hey, like I was the right guy to be, the first CMO here, but I'm not right to be the public company CMO here. Or I was good to be the, to take the revenue org from someone else, but like, I'm not the right person to stand up a revenue org in a similar company. And there's like a level of like self-awareness to like, what's your kind of calling card to like where you can slot in. And like the best candidates seem to be like really good at knowing where their lane is for that too, and will admit themselves like, yeah, like this sort of trajectory, this like moment is not my specialty, so I'm just going to avoid it entirely.
Yeah, and I think like that doesn't mean you can't evolve into doing these other things, but like
100%,
you can still evolve into these things.
Right.
So yes, and the other thing is like just be honest with the people you're like hiring and talking to, like. And if you really genuinely invest in their growth, like you can turn that person into PMM hire number 10. Like you actually can. And that for me is what makes doing this even worth it.
What? Yeah, I mean, even outside of hiring, like a ton of growth there on the team. Like, what else have you learned about? I don't know, just like developing, whether it's developing talent or scaling a team, or how you kind of like place people and build out the product marketing org there. Like so many questions I'm sure around this come up. But what have been a couple moments where it's felt like, okay, like something's clicking here?
Yeah, I think it had to, personally, I had to get comfortable with seat very transparently. Like when I first joined Carta, my thinking was like, the idea was like, I'm going to focus on 1 or 2 business areas, and there's going to be someone to come and lead all of product marketing. And over time, I ended up being that person. So the plan, like from a mindset standpoint, going into the role at Carta was like, I don't know if I'll do it at Carta, but I might do it somewhere else. So first was me getting comfortable with that. When did I know it clicked? I think the past month or so, it started to fit all together, because I didn't have a full overview of the whole team. So you don't really have a good sense of whose strengths and weaknesses are, where do you need to develop talent, etc.
Yeah.
So that was a big one for me. The team now is starting, I will say, like everyone knows where they fit and what role they play, and our relationship with products and our relationship with sales. So the learnings were with talent and development were mostly around like because I've never done it. So my whole thing was do what you wish people did with you when you started your career or at different stages of your career.
That's awesome.
And something that I learned to get comfortable with, which I first was like never really thought about it as a strength, is like very few people spend their entire career in product marketing.
Yeah.
So I really relate, and I've done it at different sizes of companies. So I could really relate to where different people's like strengths are at different stages. And I could like, because I've done it. So when someone's going through a campaign or through a research thing, like I know how to guide and what things that they're running into. Just learning your team and who brings what. And then now when we're hiring to like round out the skill sets on the team versus like generalists. Yeah.
That's a good point. And a good point about people, kind of the time in their career they spend, and the fact that you don't have a lot of, as many folks as you'd think, like who dedicate their career to product marketing. I mean, I've got, I don't know, I bounced back and forth between product and content a couple times. So I've got probably like 6 collective years of product marketing experience, call it, that I could stitch together. And it's like, I was even with that, I was starting to feel like an OG in some of these conversations, because I think a lot of people come into product marketing and they're like, well, like this will get me, what I really want to do is be a PM, or what I really want to do is, be a CMO or something, or, go up to demand gen or be a founder or something like that. So it's like, it's an awesome kind of launch pad and foundation of experience for those other experiences if you want to do that. But yeah, like when you start looking at like the field of like, hey, I need like a 10-year product marketing veteran for this team, it's like, it can be pretty sparse out there. So
it's not, there's that. And my previous manager at AngelList, Helen, has like she was very specific. I asked her like how she grew in her career and how she focused on specific, because she did PMM for her experience, like Quora, Dropbox, Plaid. So a lot of developer tools. And one of the things like that stood out was like, she was like, oh, there's very few people who know how to talk to developers and do product marketing for developers, let alone people doing product marketing. So like the talent pool strengths and your career kind of starts falling into place. And I kind of had the same benefit coming into Carta, because like very few people are in this like product marketing and private markets and like know how to talk about the ecosystem, et cetera. So like also it's a very specific type of skill set in that world, and the fintech background helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great context for all that. Absolutely. What would I? What's your advice for people interviewing for product marketing roles? I'm sure you had a lot. I'm sure you learned a lot about what works if you're interviewing. Like, what are those moments, or what do the best candidates do that make them stand out if you're actually on the other side of the table?
I think when I look at the commonalities between people that, or like the competencies that I always look for are like structured thinkers. Mm-hmm. And structured thinkers are usually very good storytellers, especially if you're a PMM. So I think like know your story and like use examples from stuff you've worked on. Also, it's okay to say like, I haven't done this. Like, it's fine. Like not everyone has done everything, especially the earlier in your career. Like there's different, like most of my questions to candidates are always around like examples of stuff they've worked on.
Yeah.
And you should know the stuff you've worked on. You should know what role you've played on it. And like, you could say like, oh, I haven't done that part of it, but like, here's how I probably would have tackled it. It's always been like, it's for me, the candidates that do really well, one, they know their stuff. And what I mean by know their stuff, like the stuff that they've worked on, when you ask them about it, they could answer their questions very clearly. They can answer the question very clearly. They could tell you a very clear story and you can have follow-ups with them. So like, it's an intellectual conversation. And candidates that like are very honest about like what has worked and what hasn't and what they would have done better have always been ones that stand out. Also be yourself. Like I see a lot of candidates come in, I'm like, you're putting on a personality. I was like, just talk. Like we're literally our job is to talk to people all the time. So just be you.
Yeah. I mean, that's got to be the intimidate. If you're in any sort of like sales or marketing interview, it's like, all right, like you're also being evaluated. Like in the event that you're like the face of this brand or product, like how's the impression, right? Like, can you kind of put on a good first impression, because you'll be doing that for customers, you'll be doing that for the market in a lot of ways.
And my advice for hiring managers is like, know who you're hiring for what role. Like if that's what you need in a role, that's screen for that. But I don't need my whole team to be that. Like that, I think it's very, because then you start hiring the same types of people. That's why I'm always competency based, because I'm like, not like I don't have anything that's like, are they a good presenter? I was like, sure. But like, if they do the work, I care about the work way more than I care about like anything else.
100%. Yeah. No, I love all that, especially around like, you know, knowing your story, being able to kind of like have that your narrative such that it's like, oh, like, even if like the way things happened was kind of random, you can kind of like explain this in a narrative way where it feels like, you know, part A chapter 1 led to chapter 2, led to chapter 3. Like that's just narrative thinking that like is a sign of great communication. Yeah, 100%. This has always worked for me, because you mentioned like have your examples, have your sort of like, or like anecdotes, but like have your examples ready that you can talk about. I think that trips people up. People get intimidated because they're like, they think they're going to have an anecdote or an example story for every single thing they've ever done or every possible question they could be asked. And it's like, no, like have your, you know, you need 2, 3, 4 kind of, you know, examples in your back pocket that you can call on for 95% of interview questions. Like, when did shit go wrong and you turned it around? When did something good happen and you learned something, or blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you kind of have those stories you can call on depending. It doesn't matter how the person asks it. You can kind of adjust the context and answer it with that story. Right. Yeah.
Because most of PMM work is kind of repetitive in your first 6-ish years. You just do them at different levels. Like it just depends on when you do. Some people start early on the research side. Some people start early on the go-to-market side, and then you need to develop them. But the frameworks should all be kind of similar. Yeah.
Dude, Seif, I could talk about this stuff all day. Obviously you could too. It's a topic near and dear to both of us, but want to be respectful of your time today. We'll have to bring you back in the future for another episode, because there's definitely more to get into. But man, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I love to nerd out about this stuff. So anytime.
Nice. If folks want to maybe say hi, you know, reach out, anything like that, how might they do that?
They could reach out on LinkedIn. It's Seif Salama, Seif. I mean, you're probably listening to this and it's in front of you. So, and then if you want to email me to chat or anything, it's safe@carta.com. So reach out anytime.
Right on. Yeah. And if you're in tech and living under a rock and haven't checked out Carta, have a look because
Check
everyone's
us
using
out.
it.
We also have
Right
open
on.
roles, so if you want to join the team, let me know.
Right on. Right on. Thanks, Seif. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Blake.
Bye.